By the late 14th century, Europe awoke to the sound of hoofbeats and the rustle of banners from a power they had barely begun to comprehend. On the far side of the Bosporus, a dynasty that had once been a mere shadow, a cluster of warriors clinging to the edges of a crumbling Anatolia, now stood at Europe's very doorstep. From the shores of the Dardanelles they surged forward, and to those watching from the walls of Balkan cities, the growth of this empire seemed less like politics and more like the rise of a natural disaster. The Ottomans did not creep. They stormed. Within decades, fortresses that had once seemed immovable, Bulgarian citadels, Serbian strongholds, fell. Local peasants spoke of them not as an army but as a tide that lapped higher each season, a tide that no one could stop. And to Western Christendom, so long accustomed to exporting war eastward, the psychological effect was profound. For centuries, Europe's nobility had crossed seas to fight Muslims in distant Outremer, marching beneath the cross to Jerusalem or Antioch. Now, that old frontier had inverted. Instead of knights sailing east to strike at Islamic realms, the Ottomans had arrived in Europe itself, and the question whispered in cathedrals and castles alike was chilling: what if the whole continent could fall? The panic was not theoretical. In 1396, on the banks of the Danube at Nicopolis, Europe's crusading ideal met Ottoman pragmatism, and shattered. The Allied host, with its glittering French nobles, Hungarian levies, and Balkan contingents, marched with the confidence of centuries of crusading tradition. What they encountered was something unfamiliar: layered entrenchments, disciplined janissaries with bows and early firearms, and a tactical patience that mocked Western impetuosity. The defeat was catastrophic. Chroniclers described the aftermath as fields strewn with armor, the rivers choked with the bodies of drowned knights. Survivors carried home not only scars but a message: this was not the war of their fathers. For the first time in living memory, Europe trembled. The chronicles of monasteries called the Ottomans a scourge, an iron storm, and even the rod of God's anger. Cities from Buda to Paris rang their bells in warning. And the Latin West, used to seeing itself as the hammer of Islam, was forced to face an unsettling reversal: the hammer had become the anvil. One voice captured the sense of dread with startling clarity. Bertrandin de la Brocquiere, a French diplomat and pilgrim, traveled into Ottoman lands in 1433, not as a knight seeking glory, but as an observer sent to understand this strange power. His verdict was grim. Murad II, the Sultan he met, was, in his words, capable of conquering all of Europe, for resistance thus far had been trifling. Bertrandin did not speak lightly. He had walked the streets of Ottoman cities, seen the efficiency of their troops, and sensed that Europe's defenses were not yet serious. His report spread through Burgundy and France like wildfire. An empire born on the far side of the Bosporus could swallow the West if it so chose. What unsettled Bertrandin, and many like him, was not only Ottoman victories but their style of war. The Ottoman army was not a mirror of Europe's, not another chivalric force bound by rituals of honor. It was diverse, layered, and adaptive. They fielded cavalry who melted away only to return in ambush, infantry who dug in with a discipline that made cavalry charges suicidal, and mercenary bands who cared more for plunder than prestige. Where Europe had knights who measured their worth by single combat, the Ottomans measured by results: a fortress taken, a levy broken, a supply line severed. To a continent still enthralled by the code of chivalry, this felt alien. French and Burgundian knights were bred to charge headlong, lances leveled, seeking personal glory as much as collective victory. Against Ottomans who favored entrenchment, volleys, and coordinated maneuver, that spirit of reckless honor became a liability. The humiliation of Nicopolis was, in many ways, the humiliation of an entire worldview. But humiliation is a dangerous teacher, and sometimes the best one. In the ashes of that defeat, questions began to spread through Europe's courts. Could the knightly class evolve? Could Christendom learn to fight a war not of banners and vows, but of trenches, bows, and gunpowder? Was Europe's future to be decided not by honor but by adaptation? The psychological weight of this question is difficult to overstate. To a people raised on crusading legends, to admit that their old ways were not enough was to admit weakness, even corruption. Yet history offers no pause. As more fortresses fell, as Balkan nobles bent the knee or were swept aside, the dilemma sharpened. Adapt or die. Even the peasants of Christendom understood the stakes. In village sermons, priests described the Ottomans not as men but as the punishment of God upon a proud Europe. In marketplaces, rumors spread of janissaries who never broke ranks, of camels that trampled knights, of sultans whose wealth could buy entire kingdoms. Fear bred stories, and stories bred resignation. Yet there were others, captives, defectors, and spies, who carried something more useful home, knowledge. That knowledge would, over the next century, become Europe's salvation. From the words of men like Konstantin Mihailovic, a janissary turned memoirist, to the reports of spies like Bertrandin, fragments of insight would be woven into a new fabric of military thought. But in these early decades, after Nicopolis, Europe had not yet learned. Its knights still rode with the arrogance of a vanished age, and its kings still trusted to providence more than preparation. The story we are about to trace is not only one of battles but of mental revolutions. It is the story of how Christendom, faced with a foe that seemed invincible, was forced to examine itself, to abandon pride, and to build a new way of war. For the Ottomans were not merely another enemy, they were a mirror, reflecting back to Europe its own complacency, its own illusions. And the mirror showed something uncomfortable, that the code of chivalry, so long the pride of knights, might now be their death sentence. In the coming chapters, we will walk battlefields littered with broken lances, read the manuals written by reluctant captives, and hear the voices of clerics who believed that resistance was not only a matter of swords but of souls. But it begins here, at the end of the 14th century, when Europe first realized that the storm rising from the east was not passing through. It was here to stay. The Ottomans who burst onto the European stage in the late 1300s were not, at first glance, destined to terrify a continent. Their founder, Osman, was a frontier chieftain, a bey, who commanded little more than a warband of semi-nomadic horsemen in Anatolia. His world was one of fractured states, where the remnants of the Seljuk dynasty smoldered in decline and Mongol rule had left both opportunity and chaos in its wake. To European eyes, such figures were brigands, raiders without pedigree. Yet Osman's descendants would build a system that transformed those frontier skirmishes into the disciplined march of an empire. The Ottoman genius lay not in sheer numbers but in their ability to weave together diverse threads: Turkic warriors, Balkan converts, Greek artisans, Arab administrators, and, in time, the children of Europe's own villages, taken through the Devserm levy. In an age when lineage and bloodlines were prized in Europe, the Ottomans built something far more pragmatic, an engine of conquest that absorbed and reforged human material wherever it found it. This pragmatism bewildered contemporaries. A Franciscan friar in India, hearing of the rising power in Anatolia, called them outstanding archers, and the most warlike and perfidious of all mankind. His words dripped with both fear and fascination. What shocked outsiders most was the Ottomans' lack of sentimentality in war. They were not bound by the codes of knightly honor that demanded duels, tournaments, or even mercy to noble prisoners. Instead, they cultivated ruthlessness as a tool, selecting the strongest, discarding the weak, and rewarding loyalty with land or coin rather than lineage. One of their most controversial innovations was the devshirme system, sometimes remembered by Europeans as a nightmare of their age. Through this levy, Christian boys, often from Balkan villages, were taken, converted, and trained to become janissaries, the Sultan's elite corps. To their families, it was trauma, sons disappeared, mothers wept, villages felt plundered. But within the Ottoman machine, those same boys were elevated, disciplined, and bound to the Sultan with a loyalty stronger than blood. To Western nobles, this was monstrous, yet to the Sultan it was efficient, a system that replaced hereditary squabbling with direct allegiance. On the battlefield, the effect was unmistakable. Janissaries became the iron heart of the Ottoman infantry, drilled in formation, wielding bows and early handguns with a professionalism alien to most European levies. Behind them rode Sipahi cavalry, landholding horsemen whose mobility echoed nomadic traditions but whose service was tied to the land grants of the empire. And above them all stood the Sultan, not as a distant figure but as the living center of this hierarchy. Europe, meanwhile, clung to older patterns. Knights still believed the shock of a heavy cavalry charge could solve almost any tactical dilemma. Honor dictated speed, to hesitate before striking the enemy was cowardice, to hold back was to risk shame. Against an opponent who preferred to lure knights into prepared traps, this culture of impulsive valor was disastrous. The Ottomans exploited this gap masterfully. Their composite bows outranged most European weapons, their scouting units ensured ambushes were frequent, and their trenches, reinforced with stakes, earthworks, and hidden ditches, could blunt even the proudest cavalry surge.
We will wait for the opportune
They did not
moment.
fight for honor, they fought for victory. That cold practicality was as shocking to Europe as the speed of their advance. The Balkans became the first crucible of this new order. In Bulgaria, once a proud kingdom of its own, Ottoman campaigns of the 14th century toppled city after city, until Tarnovo fell and the Bulgarian Tsardom was extinguished. Serbia, too, reeled. Its proud nobility, famed for valor since the days of the Nemanjic dynasty, found itself divided, its land steadily absorbed after the crushing defeat at Kosovo in 1389. By the end of the century, Ottoman garrisons dotted the Balkans, their banners planted where once Latin or Orthodox crosses had stood. For local peoples, the shock was not only military but cultural. They were confronted with a ruling elite that seemed both alien and strangely adaptable. In conquered towns, Ottoman administrators collected taxes, reorganized land, and, perhaps most striking to peasants, sometimes provided more consistent justice than local lords had. To many villagers, loyalty was a matter of survival. One ruler might demand levies for a crusade, another might collect the Sultan's taxes, but both wanted bread and coin. The Ottomans exploited this pragmatism, offering stability where feudal Europe often offered chaos. Western knights who arrived to aid these frontiers often misunderstood the situation entirely. To them, the Balkans were a borderland of Christendom under siege, a stage for heroic intervention. They did not see the decades of adaptation Balkan fighters had already endured, nor the lessons those veterans had learned the hard way.
Patience is key.
Where a
here.
Wallachian captain might
Our
advise
reconnaissance
patience,
must be precise.
reconnaissance, and ambush, a French knight saw dishonor. Where a Hungarian king counseled caution before entrenched janissaries, a Burgundian noble saw an opportunity to win eternal fame. This cultural dissonance was as deadly as any sword. It meant that, time and again, Western reinforcements charged ahead with glittering banners, only to be cut down by a disciplined enemy they neither understood nor respected. The Ottomans, by contrast, carried with them the lessons of frontier survival.
Patience is our greatest
Born
weapon
from a
in this
land
regard.
racked by Mongol raids and Seljuk collapse, they had learned from the hardest teachers: mobility, flexibility, and above all, patience. Their armies were not simply war bands, they were laboratories of tactics, experimenting with gunpowder, entrenchment, and logistics in ways that Europe would take decades to emulate. This was the foundation upon which Nicopolis would be fought, and lost. Before that infamous battle, decades of warfare had already bloodied the Balkans, teaching local princes and peasants alike what Europe had not yet grasped, that the Ottomans were not a passing storm, but a climate that could only be endured through transformation. The Balkans in the late 14th century were no longer the stable patchwork of Christian kingdoms that had once formed a barrier between the Latin West and the rising powers of the East. Instead, they had become the proving ground where Europe first measured, and repeatedly underestimated, the Ottomans. Bulgaria had already buckled. Its once proud capital at Tarnovo, with its hilltop fortress and golden domed churches, fell to Ottoman forces in 1393. Chroniclers wrote of flames devouring the royal palace, of monasteries looted, of nobles fleeing westward. Bulgaria was not merely conquered, it was dismantled. Ottoman administrators replaced the Tsarist court, their officials assessing taxes and redistributing land to loyal Sipahis. The memory of Bulgaria as an independent state would linger, but in practice it had been absorbed into the empire. Serbia, meanwhile, staggered under the weight of defeat at Kosovo in 1389. The battle became legendary in Serbian memory, a clash where Prince Lazar fell and where ballads spoke of betrayal and martyrdom. Yet beneath the epic veneer, the reality was grim. Serbia had lost its independence, and while local lords still ruled as vassals, their strength was overshadowed by the looming presence of Ottoman garrisons. To the west, Hungary watched uneasily, realizing that the once comfortable buffer of Balkan states was dissolving before its eyes. But what set the Balkans apart was not only their defeats, it was their hard-earned familiarity with Ottoman methods. Wallachians, Serbs, Bulgarians, and Hungarians all faced raids, skirmishes, and campaigns long before Western Europe sent its armored champions to intervene. This gave them an intimate knowledge of their new adversary, the Janissaries who entrenched behind stakes, the Sipahi cavalry who feigned retreat, the way Ottoman commanders could shift from lightning raids to grinding sieges with unsettling ease. Take Wallachia, for example. Under Voivode Mircea the Elder, Wallachians fought a war of ambushes and attrition, using forests, rivers, and marshes to bleed Ottoman columns. Mircea's men understood that to meet the Ottomans head-on in open ground was folly, survival required cunning, night attacks, and a willingness to retreat if needed. To Western knights, raised on the ideals of chivalry, such tactics looked suspiciously like cowardice. To Balkan veterans, it was simple common sense. This clash of cultures would soon come to a head at Nicopolis in 1396, when crusaders from France, Burgundy, and elsewhere poured into the Balkans, expecting to teach the Ottomans a lesson. What they did not grasp was that the locals had already been through that lesson many times. When Emperor Sigismund of Hungary urged caution, scouting the enemy, preparing defenses, he was speaking from experience. When Voivode Mircea counseled patience, he was remembering years of hard fighting along the Danube. But pride proved stronger than prudence. The French and Burgundian nobles who rode into the Balkans carried with them not only lances and banners, but a worldview. To them, honor demanded a headlong charge. Waiting felt like weakness. Listening to local advice risked humiliation. In their eyes, the Wallachians and Hungarians were not seasoned veterans but provincial allies, perhaps even rivals for the glory of victory. The results would be catastrophic, but in this prelude, the deeper tragedy was already clear. Europe had within its ranks the knowledge it needed to face the Ottomans, but pride and cultural arrogance prevented it from listening. To the peasants who tilled the soil along the Danube or the merchants who saw Ottoman patrols passing their villages, it mattered little whether their would-be liberators were French knights or Hungarian levies. They simply knew the cost of underestimating the Sultan's armies. They had seen villages burned, fields trampled, and captives marched away in chains. They understood what Western nobles refused to admit: the Ottomans were not a passing threat. They were a permanent force, and to fight them required unlearning centuries of habits. The Balkans thus became both a battlefield and a classroom, a place where Europe's martial traditions would either evolve or perish. In the decades leading up to Nicopolis, the warning signs had been blindingly clear. Yet when the banners of France and Burgundy unfurled on the plains of the Danube, those lessons would be cast aside. The Crusade of Nicopolis was meant to be a spectacle of Christian unity, a thunderclap that would remind the world of Europe's ability to march east and dictate the fate of kingdoms. In 1396, banners of Burgundy, France, and the Holy Roman Empire streamed into Hungary, where they joined King Sigismund's forces and the Balkan contingents of Wallachia, Transylvania, and Bulgaria's dispossessed. It was a kaleidoscope of languages, banners, and ambitions.
My friend.
Priests preached of holy war, nobles boasted of glory to come, and minstrels sharpened their songs for victories not yet won. On parchment, the army looked formidable. Tens of thousands gathered, a coalition that dwarfed most forces the Ottomans had previously faced. Its leaders imagined that they would sweep aside the Sultan's troops and drive him back across the Bosporus, restoring the Balkans and reasserting Christendom's dominance. Yet beneath the glitter of armor lay fault lines that would soon crack. The Western Knights marched with an unshakable belief in their superiority. To them, Balkan allies, Wallachians, Serbs, Vlachs, were useful auxiliaries at best, and perhaps rivals for glory. Even Sigismund of Hungary, their host and commander, was eyed with suspicion. The French nobles whispered that he feared to share in their triumph, while in truth he feared something far more tangible: the trenches, archers, and janissaries waiting ahead. When the Crusader host reached Nicopolis, perched above the Danube, they laid siege to the Ottoman-held fortress.
Our moment will come.
Yet the real contest came when Sultan Bayezid I, called Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, arrived with his army. Bayezid was no stranger to European arrogance; he knew how to bait it. His forces dug defensive lines, planted stakes against cavalry, and prepared hidden trenches. Behind them stood janissaries, disciplined and calm, and cavalry ready to countercharge once the enemy exhausted itself. At this critical juncture, two voices urged caution. Sigismund himself pleaded that the French wait, scout the enemy, and let the locals, who knew Ottoman tricks, lead the engagement. Voivode Mircea of Wallachia, hardened by years of fighting, begged the Crusaders to slow their advance until the enemy could be properly assessed. Both men had seen too many Ottoman ambushes to mistake patience for cowardice. But pride drowned out prudence. The French knights, their armor gleaming in the sun, refused to yield their honor to Balkan provincials. They whispered that Hungarians and Wallachians wanted only to steal their victory. Some suspected treachery. And so, with trumpets blaring and banners snapping, the Knights of France and Burgundy spurred their chargers forward, convinced that their charge would crush the Turks as it had crushed foes in tournaments and on fields of France. The first impact seemed glorious. Ottoman azaps, lightly armed infantry levies, broke before the armored tide, retreating in apparent panic. The knights cheered, believing the day was already theirs. But Bayezid had planned this. Behind the fleeing azaps, the hidden trenches and staked defenses awaited. Horses stumbled, knights toppled, formations dissolved in confusion. The charge slowed, then faltered. And in that moment, the Janissaries struck. Arrows darkened the sky, bolts whistled, early firearms cracked. Exhausted and unhorsed, the French knights were suddenly no longer hunters but prey. Bayezid's cavalry surged in from the flanks, cutting down those who tried to regroup. The valley became a killing ground. Sigismund, watching the disaster unfold, cursed the arrogance of his allies. He is reported to have said bitterly, "They thought themselves masters of the world, and they have been taught otherwise." In desperation, he ordered those who could to flee across the Danube. Many drowned in the attempt, others were captured. Mircea of Wallachia, having foreseen the disaster, had already withdrawn his men, saving them from annihilation. The aftermath was grim. Thousands of prisoners, many of them noble-born, were executed by Bayezid in retaliation for the Crusaders' atrocities during the march. A few high-ranking captives were spared for ransom, but the mass slaughter sent shockwaves through Europe. In Burgundy and France, widows and mothers mourned sons who had ridden east in glory and returned only as names on a roll of the dead. Nicopolis became more than a defeat, it was a humiliation. It revealed the lethal gap between chivalric pride and Ottoman pragmatism. Western knights had ridden as if the 12th century Crusades were still the measure of war, but the battlefield of the 14th century had changed. The Ottomans had combined discipline, entrenchment, and missile fire into a system that no cavalry charge, however splendid, could break. In the months and years that followed, Europe seethed with anger and despair. Chroniclers wrote that Christendom was broken. Songs of the Crusade, once meant to celebrate victory, turned to laments. Yet among those who reflected soberly, a painful truth began to emerge, that the Ottomans could not be defeated by glory alone, that tactics must change, and that listening to the advice of those who had lived under the Sultan's shadow was no shame but a necessity. Nicopolis, then, was both an ending and a beginning. It was the end of Europe's illusion that honor alone could carry the day. And it was the beginning of a century-long struggle to absorb the lessons of defeat, to transform pride into discipline, and to find a way to fight an enemy who fought differently, and who fought to win. The shock of Nicopolis rippled far beyond the battlefield. Across Europe, nobles and clerics had expected tales of victory, knights riding home with captured banners and rescued kingdoms. Instead, they received stories of slaughter, humiliation, and a sultan who executed prisoners without regard for noble rank. The horror unsettled not only kings but the very fabric of Europe's martial identity. And yet, in the silence after the disaster, the first glimmers of adaptation appeared. Though Western Europe returned home chastened, the peoples of the Balkans, those who had lived under Ottoman pressure for decades, already possessed the knowledge that could save Christendom, if only someone would listen. For a century after Nicopolis, scattered voices from Eastern Europe tried to warn their Western peers. The Serbs, reduced to vassalage after Kosovo, whispered of how Janissaries could not be broken in their trenches, how charging them was suicide. The Wallachians described Ottoman cavalry feints, where a sudden retreat could lure an enemy into a killing ground. Hungarians, watching their southern borders burn each summer, advised patience, let the Ottomans overextend, let hunger weaken them, then strike. But pride remained a stubborn obstacle. Western Europe's knightly elite, bound by centuries of chivalric tradition, were slow to take these lessons seriously. Manuals of warfare still glorified the headlong charge, the duel, the code of honor. To adopt the strategies of Balkan warlords felt to many like admitting inferiority. A French noble might sneer, "What can a peasant prince of Wallachia teach us of war?" And yet, the evidence was undeniable. Every rash advance ended in disaster, every ignored warning turned into another scar. Local commanders, those branded provincials by their Western allies, were the ones who consistently kept their armies alive. The very people dismissed as backward held the keys to survival in this new war. What Europe lacked was not courage but humility. Nicopolis had shown that courage without discipline was a death sentence. Still, it would take another generation of defeats before the knightly class began to unlearn its habits. By the mid-1400s, however, the tide of thought began to shift. No longer could Europe afford to see the Ottomans as an anomaly, a passing storm. Their advance through the Balkans continued relentlessly. Bulgaria was gone, Serbia crippled, and Wallachia only tenuously independent through its stubborn defiance. Fortress after fortress fell. Cities that had once held the banners of Christendom now flew the crescent. In this crucible, the need for a new approach grew undeniable. And while Western knights hesitated, it was often captives, defectors, and borderland survivors who began to put pen to parchment, recording the realities of Ottoman warfare. These voices, sometimes ignored, sometimes circulated in secret, would eventually become Europe's first true textbooks on how to fight the Sultan. For now, however, in the shadow of Nicopolis, Europe remained divided. Some saw the defeat as divine punishment for pride and sin, believing only prayer could shield Christendom. Others urged renewed crusade, as if another grand charge might reverse the humiliation. Still others, more quietly, began to whisper that what Europe needed was not another crusade, but another way of war. Nicopolis was more than a battle lost. It was a warning unheeded, a sign that the old ways could not prevail. Yet it would take decades, and the testimony of unlikely voices, before Christendom truly began to learn. If Europe needed teachers, they came from unexpected places. One of the most remarkable voices was not a king, nor a knight, nor even a free man, but a captive. His name was Konstantin Mihailovic, a boy from Serbia who, like so many of his generation, was swept up by the Ottoman tide. In the mid-15th century, when Mehmed II, later known as the Conqueror, was extending his reach across the Balkans, Constantine was captured during a campaign. He was still a teenager, too young to bear the scars of long service, yet old enough to be molded. Like thousands of other boys, he was taken into the Janissary Corps, the Sultan's elite household troops. To his family, this was tragedy. Their son was lost, his faith and heritage at risk. To the Ottomans, he was raw material to be reforged. For nearly a decade, from 1455 to 1463, Constantine lived as a janissary. He drilled with them, marched with them, and fought in their ranks. He learned their language, absorbed their discipline, and saw the battlefield not from the vantage point of a Christian noble or cleric, but from within the engine of Ottoman conquest itself. When he eventually escaped and returned to Christian lands, he carried with him something invaluable, the knowledge of how the enemy thought, moved, and fought. Constantine did not squander this knowledge. He wrote a memoir, a book that was both testimony and manual, designed not only to recount his captivity but to arm his fellow Christians with the insights needed to resist the Sultan. His Memoirs of a Janissary was not the rant of a bitter prisoner but the measured account of a man who had lived inside the machine. What makes Constantine's voice so striking is its complexity. He did not paint the Ottomans as demons. On the contrary, he acknowledged their virtues. He described their system of justice as fairer than many European lords. He admired the discipline of their soldiers and noted the Sultan's insistence on punctual pay. Every janissary, he recorded, was paid every quarter year without fail. Even a slave could rise by merit and fortune, building wealth or honor if he proved himself. This frankness was unsettling to his audience. To admit that the Sultan's realm could sometimes appear more orderly or just than Christendom's was to challenge cherished assumptions. Yet Constantine did not flatter, he warned. For beneath his acknowledgement of strengths lay his true purpose, to expose weaknesses. He wanted Europe to understand both why the Ottomans won and how they could be beaten. He reminded his readers of Skanderbeg, the Albanian prince once held hostage by the Ottomans, who later broke free and led decades of resistance. Skanderbeg's victories, Constantine argued, came not from blind valor but from intimate knowledge of Ottoman methods. It is far easier for one to defend himself against the Turks who is familiar with them, Constantine wrote, than for one who does not know their customs. In other words, knowledge was the first weapon. Through his memoirs, Constantine became a bridge. He carried the battlefield lessons of Ottoman discipline back into Christendom, translating them into words that European commanders could study. He described how janissaries dug trenches with astonishing speed, how they combined bows and handguns into layers of fire, how their cavalry feigned weakness only to lure enemies into traps. He also spoke of their morale, their obedience, their fear of the Sultan's wrath, and, critically, the cracks that could be exploited. Europe had never before possessed such a candid guide. While nobles argued and clerics prayed, this former captive handed them something they desperately lacked: insight. For the first time, they could glimpse the Ottoman system from within, not through rumor or exaggeration, but through lived experience. And yet, Constantine's warnings came with a challenge. To heed him required humility. It required Europe's proud knights to accept that the wisdom of a former captive might be more valuable than their own inherited traditions. It required them to rethink the battlefield not as a stage for honor, but as an arena of trenches, firearms, and logistics. In time, some would listen. But in the 1450s and 1460s, as Mehmed II stormed Constantinople and pressed into Hungary, Constantine's message was still only a whisper against the roar of conquest. His words were a lifeline, but not yet grasped. Europe was still reeling, still searching for the courage to adapt. Constantine Mihailovic did not merely recount his years in janissary ranks, he dissected them. He wanted his fellow Christians to understand, in detail, how battles were lost not by lack of bravery but by walking blindly into traps. His memoirs read less like a confession and more like a field manual, laced with stories of disaster that might have been avoided had commanders listened. One of his starkest warnings came from the Battle of Varna in 1444. Europe had rallied again, this time under the banners of King Ladislaus III of Poland and Hungary, supported by papal blessing and crusading zeal. The Allied army pressed the Ottomans hard, and at first victory seemed possible. Much of the Ottoman cavalry broke, levies scattered. To European eyes, the enemy looked cornered. And then came the fatal mistake. King Ladislaus, young and headstrong, charged directly at the position where Sultan Murad II and his janissaries had entrenched themselves. It seemed like the moment to finish the war in one glorious stroke. But what appeared to be weakness was in truth deliberate preparation. The janissaries had dug trenches, reinforced by natural ravines, and camouflaged them with brush. The Polish-Hungarian cavalry thundered forward, lances lowered, only to plunge into concealed ditchworks. Horses fell screaming, riders toppled on top of each other, and in the chaos the janissaries counterattacked. The Ladislaus himself was unhorsed and slain, his head displayed on a pike. The crusading host broke, and what might have been a turning point for Christendom collapsed into another catastrophe. Constantine's verdict was blunt: had the army respected Ottoman discipline and avoided reckless charges, the disaster might never have happened. The same pattern unfolded at the Second Battle of Kosovo in 1448. János Hunyadi, Hungary's greatest commander of the age, had already learned much from fighting the Turks. He managed to sweep Ottoman cavalry from the field, a feat that once would have secured victory. But when he turned against the Janissary Corps, entrenched and protected, his army found itself bogged down. Exhausted and bleeding, the Hungarians were eventually routed, their triumph dissolved by a single mistake, underestimating entrenched Ottoman infantry. To Constantine, these episodes were not isolated tragedies but case studies in a recurring failure. He explained that the Ottomans excelled at turning defensive entrenchments into killing grounds. Their infantry, drilled with bows, handguns, and later even small cannon, could withstand charges that would shatter most medieval armies. Against such positions, impetuous heroism was nothing more than self-destruction. Constantine amplified his warning by recalling the words of Uzun Hasan, the Turkoman ruler of the Aq Koyunlu, who had himself fought Mehmed II. "I did not think the Turkish emperor would be so weak against me in cavalry," Hasan remarked, "but in infantry, he is my master, especially in the mountains." Even a fellow Muslim warlord, no friend of Christendom, recognized the same truth: Ottoman infantry, dug in with trenches and firearms, was nearly unassailable. This was a lesson Christendom struggled to learn. For centuries, the knightly class had been conditioned to see heavy cavalry as the hammer of God, unstoppable when unleashed. But against the Ottomans, this proud tradition crumbled again and again, ground down by ditches, stakes, and relentless missile fire. Constantine's insistence was clear: Europe must change its expectations. Charging Janissaries was folly. The battlefield had become a place where gunpowder, trenches, and discipline mattered more than valor or bloodline. The age of the knight's supremacy was ending, and only those who could accept this grim truth would survive. But at the time of his writing, Europe was still in denial. Nobles clung to their traditions, and kings too often risked themselves at the front, chasing glory instead of preserving order. Constantine's words were a lantern held high in the dark, but many refused to look. Constantine Mihailovic's memoirs did more than warn of Ottoman traps at Varna or Kosovo. They also revealed the rhythm of Ottoman campaigning, how an army could move like a flood and yet never leave itself exposed. To the untrained eye, Ottoman armies seemed chaotic, a patchwork of Turks, Balkan converts, Anatolian levies, and mercenaries. But Constantine had seen the method inside the apparent disorder, a system of entrenchment that allowed even river crossings to become fortresses overnight. He described one such campaign along the Danube against Vlad III of Wallachia, better known to history as Vlad Dracula. To Europe, Dracula would become a figure of legend, a warlord whose cruelty and defiance terrified even his allies. To the Ottomans, however, he was a dangerous thorn, one who had turned their own methods of fear and ambush back against them. And yet, when Mehmed II sent his forces north, Constantine, marching with the Janissaries, witnessed how swiftly they neutralized the Wallachian advantage. Crossing the Danube was no small feat. To a European army, such a maneuver could expose its troops to cavalry attack or drowning chaos. But the Janissaries moved with astonishing discipline. Within hours of crossing, Constantine wrote, they dug in an improvised fortress lined with sharpened stakes and bristling with cannon. To Vlad's cavalry, circling and probing for weakness, the position was unassailable. They could do nothing to us, Constantine recalled with blunt precision. And this was only the beginning. Once established, the Janissaries did not remain fixed. They carried their stakes and guns forward, constructing a second entrenchment closer to the enemy, then another, and another, until their slow, bristling advance consumed ground like a creeping wall of iron and wood. In open country, cavalry had no answer. Even in forests or marshes, the Ottomans adapted, digging wherever they stood, always transforming themselves from marchers into defenders before the enemy could strike. Constantine likened it to facing a fortress that walked. To a knight used to decisive charges, the experience was maddening. One could ride down Ottoman light troops, scatter their raiders, even chase their cavalry from the field, but the Janissary corps, entrenched and bristling with firepower, remained untouchable. They could not be outflanked quickly, for their lines were anchored by ditches and stakes. They could not be overrun, for their discipline held even under withering assault. And as soon as the enemy retreated to regroup, the Janissaries would inch forward, fortress after fortress, until the ground itself belonged to them. The secret, Constantine emphasized, was not only discipline but the marriage of labor and firepower. Every Janissary was as much a laborer as a fighter, able to dig trenches, drive stakes, and mount cannon at a pace that stunned European observers. Their weapons, bows, handguns, small cannon, were chosen to maximize defense and to demoralize attackers who could not break through. For Christian cavalry, accustomed to dominating open plains, this was like charging against a stone wall that rebuilt itself wherever it moved. To underline the danger, Constantine recalled how even after an Ottoman retreat, their ability to entrench gave them time to recover. European knights, weighed down by heavy armor, often failed to pursue quickly enough. By the time they caught up, the Janissaries had already built a new line, ready to repel. What seemed like victory would dissolve into another stalemate, or worse, another trap. This lesson, too, was slow to sink in. Europe's knightly commanders prided themselves on speed and shock, on the thunder of hooves. But against the Ottomans, speed was never enough. The enemy's discipline turned mobility into futility. Cavalry charges that might once have ended battles now ended only in exhaustion and blood. The Danube campaign also revealed something more subtle, the Ottoman army's flexibility.
To the Sultan.
Vlad Dracula's reputation for cruelty was well earned.
How can we possibly
He
fund
impaled
this crusade?
prisoners by the thousands, left forests of corpses to terrify men's soldiers, and waged a relentless guerrilla war. Many in Europe celebrated his defiance, calling him a scourge of the Turk.
Lord, a token
But
of our
Constantine,
esteem.
who faced him from within the Janissary ranks, saw how the Ottomans adapted even to such horrors. Fear was answered with discipline, terror was met with method. Vlad could harass and horrify, but he could not stop the slow grind of an army that turned every field into a fortress. For Europe, this was a revelation and a warning. The Ottoman way of war was not invincible, but it was different, built on principles that chivalric Europe did not yet understand. To defeat it, one would have to learn not only to fight with valor but to outdig, outweight, and outthink the Janissary fortress that walked.
We swear loyalty
If
to the
trenches
Sultan.
and discipline made the Ottoman army
cannot
formidable
afford
on the
this crusade.
battlefield,
The coffers
it was
are
the
empty.
Sultan's immense
We must
wealth that
find a
ensured it
way.
never collapsed from within. To Konstantin Mihailovic, this was one of the greatest revelations of his captivity. War was not won only by swords and charges but by coin,
loyalty
by
is
the
yours.
relentless flow of money that bound men together with loyalty stronger than feudal
We
oaths.
understand each other.
The Janissaries were at the center of
We
this
pledge our
system.
lives to the Sultan.
Unlike most European soldiers, who relied on seasonal levies or the uncertain promises of lords, Janissaries were paid directly and predictably. Every quarter year without fail, Constantine emphasized, the Sultan's treasurers delivered wages. This punctuality was not a trivial detail, it was the foundation of discipline. A man who knew his pay would arrive did not desert. A soldier whose service brought not only survival but advancement had
allegiance
reason
to
to
the
obey,
Sultan
even
and
unto
to the
death.
Ottoman Empire.
And advancement was real.
We are out of
Even a
funds.
boy seized
We
through the
cannot finance
discern
this
could,
crusade,
if
but
he
we
proved
must protect
himself,
our land.
rise from obscurity
There
to
is nothing
command,
left in the
wealth,
coffers.
and influence. Europe's armies were often chained by birthright, their command structures clogged with aristocrats who had earned nothing but inherited everything. In contrast, the Sultan's household rewarded merit. A slave could become a commander, a Christian boy could rise to shape the fate of provinces. This radical inversion unsettled Europe, where class and bloodline had long seemed immutable. The Sultan's purse did more than sustain discipline, it bought loyalty across the empire's vast, fractured lands. Strongholds captured from Bulgarians, Serbs, and Greeks were not left to chance. They were garrisoned by troops loyal to the Sultan, men whose salaries tied them directly to his fortunes. Every fortress, every outpost, was not only a stone wall but an extension of the treasury's reach. Externally, wealth became a weapon as sharp as any blade. Bribes turned enemies into allies, convinced wavering nobles to defect, or sowed discord among Christendom's fragile coalitions. A single purse of Ottoman gold could fracture an alliance, undoing months of papal negotiations. And unlike Europe, where kings struggled to finance even one crusade, the Sultan had steady revenue, taxes from fertile Anatolia and the Balkans, tribute from vassals, customs duties from ports that connected him to the Silk Road. Money flowed like a river, and with it came security. Even acts of extraordinary loyalty or courage could be purchased. Ottoman chronicles tell of soldiers rewarded with estates, slaves, or treasure for feats that served the Sultan's cause. To Europeans, this seemed almost mercenary, a loyalty bought, not born. But it worked. When the Sultan's banner rose, his household troops followed without hesitation, bound not by feudal contract but by professional expectation. This fiscal machinery revealed another uncomfortable truth. Europe's crusading armies, assembled in bursts of zeal, often collapsed as soon as funding dried up. Knights expected ransom, plunder, or land to make their service worthwhile. When none came, they drifted home. By contrast, the Sultan's forces were permanent, professional, and salaried. War for the Ottomans was not a temporary expedition, it was a state of being. Constantine's account lingered on this point because he knew how demoralizing it was for Christian commanders. To fight the Ottomans meant not only facing their trenches and cannons but an institution that did not dissolve when the season ended. Even in winter, when European lords disbanded their troops, the Sultan's men drilled, trained, and prepared. They did not vanish back to farms, they sharpened the machine. Behind this efficiency was also a psychological truth: the Sultan's wealth was not merely gold, it was certainty. Every soldier, whether janissary, sipahi, or azap, believed that their service was part of something inexhaustible. In Europe, kings could fall bankrupt, nobles could refuse levies, and crusades could dissolve in politics. But in the Ottoman ranks, the image of the Sultan as inexhaustible patron, commander, and paymaster created a unity that terrified observers like Bertrand de la Brocquiere and Constantine alike. Thus, when Europe looked across the battlefield, it did not simply see men. It saw an empire funded like no other, where loyalty was reinforced with coin, where garrisons were not improvised but institutional, and where defection and disunity among enemies could be purchased at will. To defeat such an enemy would require not just valor, but a system of finance and permanence that Europe had barely begun to imagine. For all their wealth, discipline, and innovation, the Ottomans were not invincible. Constantine Mihailovic, having marched in their ranks, knew this better than most. His memoirs of a janissary did not merely praise their efficiency, it pointed unflinchingly to the cracks that lay hidden beneath the armor of empire. The greatest of these vulnerabilities, Constantine wrote, was fear not of battle, but of rebellion. The Ottoman state rested on a paradox. In Europe, Conquerors often became a minority ruling over conquered Christians who outnumbered them by many times. Mehmed II himself reportedly confessed to his court that if a large, unified Christian army were ever to march against him, the subject peoples of the Balkans would rise in revolt. He urged his commanders never to overreach, never to seize too much at once. Expansion had to be gradual, lest the weight of empire trigger its own collapse. Constantine confirmed this in his own observations. Among subject Christians, Serbs, Bulgarians, Greeks, resentment seethed just below the surface. They paid taxes, they endured levies, but their loyalty was thin. Whenever Christian armies advanced, villagers murmured of revolt, waiting for a spark. It was only the Ottomans' relentless pressure and the absence of coordinated European invasions that kept these provinces docile. The message was clear: a great Christian alliance, properly timed, could ignite a continent-wide uprising. On the battlefield, Constantine noted other flaws. Ottoman artillery, though fearsome, was often disorganized. At Belgrade in 1456, during one of their few outright failures, the massive siege guns were left in a sprawling heap of equipment. A sudden Hungarian assault set fire to the camp, torching powder and destroying cannons. Their reliance on firepower, if not guarded with care, could backfire disastrously. Supplies were an even more glaring weakness. Unlike many European hosts, which dragged ponderous wagons across the countryside, the Ottomans often traveled light, carrying only what they could forage or seize. This gave them speed, but also made them fragile. If an opposing army could deny them provisions, force them into prolonged standoffs, or harass their baggage trains, the Sultan's forces could wither quickly. Hunger was a foe no entrenchment could withstand. From these vulnerabilities, Constantine drew a series of prescriptions, tactical advice that, if heeded, might turn the tide. First, abandon the suicidal habit of charging Janissary entrenchments head-on. The memory of Varna and Kosovo proved that cavalry, no matter how glorious, would always be shattered against stakes, ditches, and gunpowder. Instead, armies should advance obliquely, probing the flanks, harassing rather than rushing. Second, he urged Europeans to imitate the Tatar horsemen who had so often harried Ottoman forces. Heavy armor was a burden in this new style of war. Lightly armed cavalry, nimble and enduring, could chase down raiders, cut off retreating units, and strike supply lines. Europe's knights had to shed their pride in gleaming plate and adopt the speed of the steppe. Third, and most dramatically, Constantine suggested targeting the Ottomans' lifeblood, their baggage animals. The Sultan's armies depended on long trains of camels to haul equipment, powder, and supplies. Fire arrows loosed into these beasts could unleash chaos, sending panicked animals crashing through their own lines. Flaming arrows, he insisted, could transform order into mayhem, as stampeding camels tore apart carefully constructed defenses. Constantine claimed to have witnessed this tactic himself, knowing how devastating it could be. Lastly, he counseled restraint for Europe's kings. Too often monarchs rode at the head of charges, eager to prove valor. This was folly, he said. The Sultan himself never risked his life recklessly, he commanded from safety, preserving order. European kings should do the same, holding back from the chaos of the melee to maintain discipline across the whole field. To many in Europe, such counsel sounded strange, even dishonorable. Light armor, indirect attacks, harassing supply lines, setting fire to baggage trains. This was not the language of knightly glory, it was the language of survival. And yet, Constantine knew that survival required humility. Unless Europe abandoned its illusions, the cycle of Nicopolis and Varna would repeat forever. His prescriptions were not fantasies. They aligned with the observations of others, Hungarian commanders, Wallachian voivodes, even foreign rulers who had fought the Sultan. Time and again, the lesson was the same: the Ottomans could be beaten, but only if Europe shed its pride and learned to fight a new kind of war. For now, however, such advice spread slowly. Captives like Constantine wrote in languages and regions far from Western Europe's centers of power. His book circulated in Czech and Polish, not French or Latin. The people who most needed his warnings often never read them. Still, the seeds had been planted. The day would come when Europe would not only read these words but begin to act upon them. While Konstantin Mihailovic offered Europe a soldier's view from within the Ottoman ranks, another figure provided intelligence of a different kind, a spy cloaked as a pilgrim. His name was Bertrandin de la Brocquiere, a Burgundian nobleman, courtier, and diplomat. In 1432, he undertook a perilous journey eastward, traveling through Ottoman lands under the guise of a religious pilgrim bound for the Holy Land. In reality, he was gathering knowledge for his master, Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy. Bertrandin's mission was simple in aim but dangerous in execution: to study the Ottomans up close and to learn how they might be defeated. He journeyed across Anatolia and Rumelia, observed troops, spoke with locals, and even managed to gain an audience with Sultan Murad II himself. What he saw left him deeply troubled. In his memoir, Le Voyage d'Outre-mer, Bertrandin painted a portrait of an empire that could, if it chose, sweep aside much of Europe. Murad II, whom he met personally, was in his words not overly fond of campaigning but deeply fond of feasts and drink. This, Bertrandin mused, was Europe's good fortune, for if the Sultan had been more warlike, the Christian kingdoms might already have been crushed. The implication was chilling: Europe's survival was balanced not on its own strength, but on the temperaments of its enemy. Yet Bertrandin's analysis was not despairing. He studied carefully how the Ottomans organized their armies. He noted that, unlike European kings who bankrupted themselves to maintain standing forces, the Ottomans managed to field permanent troops without bleeding their coffers. The Divserm system created a steady stream of elite janissaries, numbering perhaps 5,000 to 6,000. These were salaried, loyal, and disciplined. Around them gathered the Sultan's azaps and provincial levies, tens of thousands, often poorly armed, carrying little more than staves. These masses, Bertrandin believed, were cannon fodder, brittle in combat. It was this combination, an elite corps surrounded by a vast but fragile host, that Bertrandin urged Europe to exploit. He reasoned that if Western armies maintained discipline and held their ground, the Ottoman levies would crumble. The danger came only if Europe fell into disorder, chasing false retreats or scattering for plunder, which would expose them to counterattack by janissaries and Sipahi cavalry. Order, not zeal, was the key to survival. Bertrandin admired the obedience he saw in Ottoman soldiers. Much like the Mongols before them, the Ottomans excelled at ambushes, scouting, and feigned retreats. They galloped silently to chosen sites, concealed their movements, and struck with precision. They even employed unusual tactics, using firecrackers to terrify enemies, or driving camels into enemy lines to scatter cavalry. These were not the nightly duels of Europe, this was warfare stripped to its cruel logic. And yet, Bertrandin did not think them unbeatable. He was confident that European longbows and crossbows outranged Turkish bows. If armies could be built around masses of archers and crossbowmen, protected by pikemen and cavalry, their firepower could decimate Ottoman levies and even pressure janissaries. What mattered most, he warned, was cohesion. A European commander must not allow his troops to splinter into reckless charges, as had happened so often before. Another crucial point was local support. Bertrandon stressed that any Western army invading Ottoman territory must pay its way and treat local Christian peasants with respect. If they pillaged, as crusaders often did, they would turn potential allies into enemies. If, however, they came as protectors, they might rally revolts among subject peoples. This, combined with disciplined infantry firepower, could unravel the Sultan's grip on Europe. His message echoed that of Balkan veterans: patience, discipline, and humility were the tools of victory. The enemy thrived on arrogance and impetuosity. Only by breaking the habits of chivalry and listening to those who knew Ottoman warfare could Europe hope to endure. Bertrandon's report circulated widely in Burgundy and France. Unlike Constantine's memoirs, buried in Eastern languages, Bertrandon wrote for the Western courts. His observations, practical and sobering, carried weight among policymakers who had never set foot in the Balkans. Though Europe was still slow to adapt, voices like his were beginning to chip away at the illusions of knightly invincibility. To Western observers like Bertrandon de la Brocquiere, the most unsettling aspect of Ottoman power was not simply its battlefield tactics but the machinery that produced soldiers year after year. Unlike the episodic armies of Christendom, raised by feudal call, held together by vows of service, and disbanded when funds ran dry, the Ottomans had engineered a permanent system of war. At its heart was the Devşirme, the levy of boys taken from Christian villages, especially in the Balkans. To European chroniclers, it was remembered as one of the darkest features of Ottoman rule: mothers wailing as their sons were led away, priests lamenting lost flocks, families torn apart. It was both taxation and trauma, a reminder that Ottoman power reached not just into land but into bloodlines. Yet from the Ottoman perspective, it was ingenious. Those boys, converted to Islam, were trained to become janissaries or administrators. They owed their rise not to feudal lords or hereditary privilege but to the Sultan himself. Their loyalty was unbreakable, for their fortunes were tied directly to the dynasty. A Christian captive might become a commander, a vizier, even a grand strategist of empire. Europe recoiled at this system, but it worked, and it produced a corps of soldiers whose discipline astonished even their enemies. Surrounding this elite were the Azaps, the tens of thousands of irregular infantry who filled out Ottoman armies. Poorly equipped, often carrying little more than spears or staves, they were seen as expendable. To Western eyes, they were rabble. But their very expendability was a weapon. The Azaps absorbed the shock of charges, tired out enemies, and created the illusion of weakness, drawing knights into overconfidence. Behind them, waiting silently, were the janissaries, the real hammer of the Sultan. Then came the Sipahis, the cavalrymen who held land in exchange for service. They were heirs to steppe traditions, fast-moving horsemen who could harass, feign retreat, and encircle foes with unnerving speed. For European knights accustomed to seeing themselves as the finest cavalry in the world, facing Sipahis was a rude awakening. These riders were lighter, quicker, and unburdened by the weight of armor. Against them, heavy horse often felt clumsy and slow. What made the system so resilient was not only its structure but its morale. The Sultan's troops were bound together by obedience. Bertrandon de la Brocquiere marveled at their silence on the march, their willingness to endure hunger, their refusal to break ranks even under fire. In contrast, European levies often quarreled, looted, and deserted. An Ottoman commander gave an order, and it was obeyed without question. In battle, this unity allowed them to execute feigned retreats and ambushes with precision. To Europe's fractured hosts, such cohesion seemed alien. There was also the material economy of Ottoman warfare. Their soldiers required less provision than heavily armored Europeans. They traveled light, carrying bows, maces, or sabers rather than the cumbersome plate armor and lances of knights. Their horses, bred for endurance, could subsist on poorer forage. A campaign that might bankrupt a European crown could be sustained by the Sultan's treasury without collapse. For European commanders, this created a maddening contrast. They strained to finance even one crusade, while the Sultan fielded armies year after year as if war was simply the natural order of things.
Just take the gold. You will be free.
Knights might wait for summons, but janissaries drilled constantly. Peasants might resist taxation in Christendom, but Ottoman lands provided steady revenues. Even defeat did not cripple them for long, the machinery of levies and taxation ensured recovery. To many, it seemed the Ottomans had solved the problem that plagued medieval Europe: how to transform war from an episodic campaign into a permanent institution. Their armies were not only larger but more predictable, more disciplined, and more sustainable.
Our Father, who art in
Yet,
heaven,
as observers like
hallowed be thy
Bertrand
name.
reminded their
Thy
readers,
kingdom come,
this very
thy
system
will be
carried
done.
the seeds of weakness. An empire built on
is for
obedience could crack
souls
if
who-
rebellion spread. An army that traveled light could starve if denied forage. The key was not to mirror the Ottomans exactly but to learn where to strike, to discipline Europe's own forces, to pay them well enough to keep order, and to win the loyalty of the oppressed Christian populations who longed for
Our
liberation.
Father, who art in heaven,
For now,
hallowed
however,
be thy name.
Europe could only
Thy
marvel
kingdom
and
come,
shudder.
Thy will be done.
They saw an enemy whose manpower seemed inexhaustible, whose
War
armies were as
is for
permanent as the
souls
seasons,
too.
and whose loyalty was tied not to noble oaths but to the gold and authority of the Sultan. It was, to the knights of Christendom, a different world altogether, a machine of war disguised as a dynasty. If the battlefield was one arena of struggle, the soul was another.
Our
To many
Father,
Europeans,
who art in
what
heaven,
made the Ottoman
hallowed be
threat
thy
so
name.
terrifying was
Thy
not
kingdom
simply that they
come,
conquered
thy
lands,
will be
but
done.
that they conquered
So let
minds.
the heavens tremble
For
and
the
earth
Ottomans,
groan.
religion was not merely a personal
War
faith,
is for
it was a
souls
weapon
too.
of empire. One of the most haunting voices on this subject came from George of Hungary, a cleric captured in Transylvania during an Ottoman raid
Join
in
us, and
1438.
this wealth could be yours.
He remained in captivity for over 20
My
years,
soul
living
is
not
not for
only
sale.
among the Turks but under the daily
Our
pressure
Father,
to
who art
abandon
in
his
heaven,
faith.
hallowed be thy
When
name.
he finally escaped,
kingdom
he wrote
come,
his Tractatus,
thy will be
a
done.
book that blended memoir and warning.
For
His
this
message
war
was stark:
is
the
for
danger of the
souls
Ottomans
too.
was not only military but spiritual. George recounted how captives, stripped of freedom and family, were tempted with rewards if they embraced Islam. The incentives were powerful: freedom, wealth, even prestige. A Christian slave could rise to comfort
Our
or
Father,
authority
who
if he
art in
converted,
heaven,
while refusal
hallowed
meant a
be thy
lifetime
name.
of servitude.
Thy kingdom come.
For peasants
Thy will
already
be
living
done.
under poverty and
War is not
oppression,
only
the
for
promise of
land,
advancement
for
could
treasure,
outweigh the
for
pull of
lives,
tradition.
But it is for souls
The rewards for
too.
conversion are vast, George warned, but the price is the soul. His account was filled with both anguish and urgency. He described
You
the
will regret
psychological
this.
warfare of captivity, the constant pressure to doubt, the lure of material
I will
gain,
not.
the slow
Our
erosion of
Father,
resolve.
who art in heaven,
To George,
hallowed
the
be thy
conquest
name.
of Europe was
Thy
not simply
kingdom
about
come,
cities and
thy
castles,
will be done.
it was about faith itself.
This is a
If
fight
Christians
for the
lost
very
their conviction,
soul of
they would
Europe.
lose their identity long before they lost their armies. This idea struck deeply in Europe. Sermons began to echo George's warning, portraying the struggle
Take the
against the
coins, old
Ottomans
man.
as a cosmic
Will not.
war between Christendom and Islam. For clerics, every fallen fortress was not just
Our
a political
Father, who art in
setback
heaven,
but a battlefield and
hallowed
a
be thy
spiritual
name.
war.
Thy kingdom come.
To surrender
thy
to the
will be
Sultan
done.
meant not only paying tribute but risking conversion, apostasy,
war
and the unraveling
is
of
for your
Christian
souls.
society. George's words later found a powerful audience in Martin Luther, who, in 1529, after the failed Ottoman siege of Vienna, penned a preface to a new edition of the Tractatus. Luther declared that George's testimony had left a deep impression on him. For Luther, the Ottomans were not merely enemies of empire but a scourge sent to test Christian faith. He urged Europeans not only to prepare arms but to know the Quran, to study Islamic thought, and to steel themselves for theological battle. Resistance, he argued, required not only swords but scripture. Thus, religion became intertwined with strategy. Faith was no longer just the justification for crusade, it was a shield against assimilation.
Our Father,
Preachers reminded their flocks that keeping to their creed, even under captivity, was a form of resistance. To hold firm in prayer and belief was, in their eyes, to deny the Sultan his ultimate victory. But there was also a darker side. The framing of the conflict as a holy war intensified divisions, turning the Balkans into a borderland where suspicion and zeal deepened suffering. Converts were seen as traitors, captives who wavered were accused of weakness.
Hallowed be thy name.
The battlefield of the soul was every bit as merciless as the battlefield of steel. George of Hungary's voice thus joined those of Constantine Mihailovic and Bertrand de la Brocquiere in shaping Europe's understanding of the Ottoman threat. But while Constantine offered tactical lessons, and Bertrand in practical strategies, George's testimony was about survival of identity. His warning was that even if Europe mustered the discipline to resist militarily, it must also defend itself spiritually, or else victory on the field would mean little if hearts were lost in the process. By the mid-15th century, Christendom could no longer afford illusions. Constantinople had fallen in 1453, sending a tremor through every court and cathedral in Europe. Mehmed II, the conqueror, had shattered not only walls of stone but the psychological barrier that separated East from West. If the Queen of Cities could fall, what fortress was safe? Yet even amid despair, something was changing. The defeats of Nicopolis, Varna, and Kosovo were no longer seen only as humiliations, they were becoming lessons. A century of painful encounters had begun to reshape how Europe thought about war. Slowly, fitfully, the knightly code of reckless valor gave way to a new doctrine: patience, reconnaissance, combined arms, and firepower. The first element of this transformation was reconnaissance. Gone were the days when kings and nobles could march blindly into Ottoman territory, assuming that Providence would guide their lances. Veterans who had survived battles with the Sultan insisted on the necessity of scouts, intelligence, and local knowledge. The Wallachians and Hungarians had always known this, now Western leaders, chastened by disaster, began to listen. An army that understood where trenches lay, where ambushes lurked, and how the enemy moved had a chance to survive. The second was discipline in arms. European commanders slowly realized that heavy cavalry charges alone were obsolete against entrenched janissaries. Infantry, long neglected in prestige, rose in importance. Archers, crossbowmen, and, increasingly, gunners became the backbone of defensive lines. Protected by pikemen and cavalry on the flanks, they could deliver sustained volleys that even janissaries respected. The age of the nightly duel was waning, the age of concentrated fire was dawning. The third was siegecraft and counter-entrenchment. To face an army that could turn any river crossing into a fortress, Europeans had to learn to dig, to build, to match labor with labor. Fortifications were no longer static castles but mobile camps, fortified on the march.
The scouts report.
Engineers became as vital as knights, their skills deciding whether an army lived or starved. The fourth was command restraint. Too many battles had been lost because kings, driven by honor or impatience, placed themselves in reckless danger. Constantine Mihailovic had urged rulers to imitate the Sultan, stay back, preserve order, direct the army as a whole. The lesson was slow to take
Commander,
root,
the enemy
but
is in
eventually
disarray.
commanders realized
Pursue
that
them now.
leadership was
No,
not
we
measured
hold our
by
ground.
galloping at the head of a charge, but by maintaining discipline across the field. And finally, there was logistics warfare. Europe began to understand what Constantine had stressed: the Ottomans carried light, their supply chains fragile. A war of attrition, denying them forage, prolonging campaigns into winter, or cutting their baggage lines could force even the Sultan's army into retreat.
Commander,
To
they are
resist
fleeing.
did not always
We can
mean to
pursue them.
charge, sometimes it
We
meant
hold.
to endure, to wait, and to starve the enemy into desperation. These shifts were not immediate, nor were they consistent. Old habits clung stubbornly to the nobility, and many still dreamed of crusading glory. But beneath the surface, Europe was changing. Manuals circulated that described Ottoman tactics in detail. Captives wrote warnings, spies wrote reports, commanders wrote instructions. The culture of war was slowly absorbing the reality of its new opponent. This transformation marked more than military adaptation, it marked the erosion of the old chivalric order. The knight, once the symbol of Christian might, was no longer enough.
Commander,
War was
they are
becoming a
fleeing.
science,
We
a
must pursue them
discipline of
now.
coordination,
We will not.
calculation, and patience. The battlefield was no longer a stage for honor but a crucible where survival belonged to those who could learn. In this shift, Europe found its first foothold of hope. For while the Ottomans had forced humiliation upon Christendom, they had also, unwittingly, become its harshest teachers. Each defeat was a lesson carved in blood, each retreat, a reminder that pride could not substitute for preparation. And out of these lessons would emerge the strategies that, in time, would halt the Sultan's tide. History often advances not in steady progress but in lurches, moments of triumph followed by relapses into old mistakes. The struggle between Europe and the Ottomans was no different. For every sign of adaptation, there came reminders that pride and impatience still ran deep. The 15th and early 16th centuries produced battles that revealed both sides of this story, moments where Christendom finally applied hard-learned lessons, and moments where it stumbled back into ruin. One of the earliest and most dramatic examples of success was the Siege of Belgrade in 1456. Mehmed II, fresh from the conquest of Constantinople, turned his attention north, determined to seize Hungary's gateway fortress. The city seemed doomed. Its walls shook under the thunder of massive Ottoman cannon, the same weapons that had shattered Byzantium. Yet here, Europe's defenders applied new methods. Leading the defense was János Hunyadi, the same commander who had been humbled at Kosovo years before. This time, he brought discipline. Instead of reckless charges, he organized sorties at key moments, harassed the Ottoman siege lines, and carefully coordinated the city's defenders with his relief army. When a critical moment arrived, the Hungarians launched a sudden assault on the Ottoman artillery park, setting fire to powder and destroying cannons. The Sultan's vaunted siege machine collapsed into chaos.
Huzzah!
Belgrade held, and for the first time in decades, the Ottoman tide was checked. Europe rang its church bells in triumph. Yet even this victory carried a lesson: it had been won not by cavalry charges but by discipline, fortifications, and the willingness to target the enemy's weakest point, their supplies and artillery. But the pendulum of history swung back with devastating force at Mohacs in 1526. Here, the Kingdom of Hungary faced Suleiman the Magnificent, whose armies outnumbered and outclassed them. Hungarian knights, proud heirs to centuries of frontier defense, repeated the mistake of Nicopolis and Varna. Against a foe entrenched with artillery and janissaries, they charged headlong. The result was annihilation. King Louis II himself perished, drowned in a marsh while fleeing the field. In less than 2 hours, Hungary's independence was shattered, its nobility decimated, its lands open to Ottoman rule. Mohacs became a byword for catastrophe, a grim reminder that forgetting the lessons of the past could destroy entire kingdoms. And yet, even after Mohacs, Europe found resilience. Just 3 years later, Suleiman marched on Vienna in 1529, determined to plant his banner in the heart of Central Europe. The city's defenders, though outnumbered, drew upon decades of bitter lessons. They fortified walls, dug trenches, and braced themselves for siege rather than rash battle. Rain and mud slowed the Sultan's guns, and sorties from the garrison harassed his lines. When repeated assaults failed to breach Vienna's defenses, Suleiman withdrew. For the first time, an Ottoman advance into the core of Europe was decisively stopped. The contrast between Mohacs and Vienna was striking. One showed the ruin of chivalric pride, the other the survival born of patience and discipline. Together, they illustrated that Europe's fate would hinge not on courage alone but on memory, whether commanders remembered the lessons written at Nicopolis, Kosovo, and Varna, or whether they let ambition lure them into the same traps. In the collective consciousness of Christendom, these battles became markers of identity. Belgrade was celebrated in sermons as proof that God still favored those who fought with prudence. Mohacs was mourned in ballads as a national tragedy, a day when glory turned to dust. Vienna was hailed as a miracle of endurance, a bulwark that saved Europe itself. Each story reinforced the central truth: the Ottomans could be resisted, but only by those who had the humility to learn. By the early 16th century, then, Europe was no longer the continent that had stumbled blindly at Nicopolis. It was scarred, bloodied, often divided, but it was also wiser. The age of the knightly charge was ending, and a new age of fortified cities, disciplined infantry, and strategic patience was dawning. Against the Ottomans, survival demanded nothing less. By the mid-16th century, the Ottoman Empire had carved itself deep into Europe, pressing as far as Hungary and battering at the gates of Vienna. Yet as the Sultan's banners advanced, so too did Europe's evolution. The lessons of a century of defeats were hardening into new institutions, new technologies, and new ways of fighting. And nowhere was this more dramatically revealed than on the sea. In 1571, at the Battle of Lepanto, the Ottoman fleet met the combined forces of Spain, Venice, and the Papal States in the largest naval clash of the era. For decades, the Ottomans had dominated the Mediterranean, their galleys prowling from North Africa to the Aegean. European merchants and princes feared the sea was becoming a Turkish lake. But at Lepanto, Europe struck back with discipline and concentrated firepower. The Christian fleet, under Don John of Austria, fought not with reckless charges but with coordination. Cannons mounted on galleasses, floating fortresses bristling with guns, shattered Ottoman formations. Spanish tercios, hardened infantry trained to fight with pikes and arquebus, brought land tactics to the sea, repelling boarding parties with deadly volleys. The result was a crushing victory, hundreds of Ottoman ships destroyed or captured, tens of thousands of men killed or enslaved. The victory reverberated across Europe. Bells rang in Rome, poets declared that Christendom had been saved. And yet, even Lepanto carried nuance. Though the triumph was decisive on the day, the Ottomans rebuilt their fleet within a year. The empire was vast, its resources immense, and a single defeat, however glorious, could not topple it. But Lepanto mattered because it revealed that Europe had finally embraced a doctrine of coordinated fire, combined arms, and logistical preparation. It was proof that the tide could be stemmed, that the invincible could bleed. On land, the same transformation was reshaping the battlefield. The rise of the pike and shot system, infantry armed with long pikes to repel cavalry and firearms to deliver volleys, eroded the supremacy of both knights and janissaries. Where once the thunder of hooves or the precision of archers had decided battles, now it was the steady crack of arquebus and the disciplined squares of soldiers drilled to fight as one. Europe, fractured though it was, had stumbled into the modern age of war. Even fortifications themselves evolved. The spread of the Tres Italienne, star-shaped bastions with angled walls designed to withstand cannon fire, transformed Europe's defenses. No longer could Ottoman guns simply batter medieval walls into dust as they had at Constantinople. Cities across Italy, Germany, and the Low Countries sprouted angular defenses that forced besiegers into costly, grinding campaigns. The Ottoman model of swift assaults and rapid entrenchment met a new obstacle: fortresses engineered to resist the very weapons the Sultan had once wielded so decisively. The Ottomans adapted, of course. They too adopted firearms, improved their artillery, and experimented with new fortifications. Their armies remained formidable, their discipline intact. But they now faced a Europe that had finally learned the lessons of Nicopolis and Varna, not merely in theory but in practice. The reckless charges of knights had given way to volleys of shot, the blind marches to careful reconnaissance, the isolated city walls to engineered networks of defense. Still, the balance remained precarious. Victories like Lepanto or the defense of Vienna were not the end of the Ottoman threat but milestones on a long, grueling road. Each triumph carried with it the sobering realization that the enemy would return, rebuilt, resilient, and ready to test Europe again. The struggle was no longer one of sudden crusades or single battles, but of endurance, centuries of attrition, adaptation, and learning. In this grinding contest, Europe discovered a paradox: it owed its survival not only to its own resilience but to the relentless pressure of the Ottomans themselves. Without the discipline of janissaries to challenge them, without the thunder of Ottoman cannon to terrify them, Europe might never have shed its medieval illusions. The Sultan's armies were both adversary and teacher, forcing a continent to modernize by the edge of the sword. While cannon fire and cavalry clashes drew the eyes of chroniclers, the struggle between Europe and the Ottoman Empire was waged just as fiercely in quieter arenas, through politics, treachery, and information. For both sides, victory was never only about battles won, it was about alliances forged, enemies divided, and knowledge gained. The Ottomans themselves understood this well. Their empire was a mosaic of peoples: Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, Armenians, Arabs, Albanians, and many more. Conquest had bound them together under the Sultan's authority, but beneath the surface lay resentments and ambitions. To govern, the Ottomans relied on a mixture of coercion and co-option. Bribes bought the loyalty of nobles who might otherwise rebel. Tribute placated provinces too costly to subjugate directly. And Christian vassals, from Serbian despots to Wallachian voivodes, were often left to rule their lands so long as they provided troops and taxes. This flexibility made the empire resilient, but also fragile. A rebellion in Albania under Skanderbeg tied down Ottoman armies for decades. A revolt in Wallachia under Vlad Dracula bled resources and humiliated Mehmed II. Every time the Sultan marched west, he knew he carried with him not only soldiers but the weight of subject peoples who might see his defeat as their chance to rise. Europe, for its part, was rarely able to capitalize fully on this weakness.
We must secure these mountain
Christendom was
passes before
divided,
dawn.
by rival kings, by papal politics, by the bitter wounds of the 100 Years' War and the Reformation. Time and again, the Ottomans exploited this disunity. A crusade might be proclaimed, but while France quarreled with England and German princes feuded with the emperor, the Sultan pressed on. The Turks' advance, one contemporary wrote bitterly, because Christians cannot agree. Still, There were moments when Europe struck at the Ottoman system with cunning rather than brute force. Diplomats and spies traveled east disguised as merchants or pilgrims, gathering intelligence on troop movements and fortifications. Bertrand de la Brocquier's mission had been one of the first, but by the 16th century, such espionage was common. Reports flowed back to Venice, to Vienna, to Krakow, sketches of forts, notes on supply lines, whispers of discontent among subject peoples. Sometimes bribery worked both ways.
Through the northern pass.
The Ottomans might pay off a Hungarian noble to look the other way, but European princes could also slip coin to an Ottoman governor to delay his advance. Borderlands became laboratories of intrigue, where alliances shifted like sand. A voivode one year could be a loyal vassal of the Sultan, the next, he might swear allegiance to Hungary. The frontier was not a line but a negotiation, always in motion. Information itself became a weapon. Captives who escaped from Ottoman lands, like Constantine Mihailovic or George of Hungary, were prized not only for their testimony but for their knowledge of fortresses, routes, and customs. Manuals were written, sermons preached, chronicles compiled.
We offer you wealth and security.
Slowly, the scattered warnings of captives and spies coalesced into a body of knowledge that shaped strategy.
We need to move quickly.
Europe began to see the Ottomans not as an unknowable scourge but as an
strike now.
enemy with patterns, strengths, and weaknesses. Yet the greatest obstacle was always Europe's own fragmentation. The Ottomans knew how to exploit it, offering truces to one kingdom while striking another, supporting rival claimants to thrones, or sending subsidies to discontented nobles. Where Europe hesitated, the Sultan acted. The irony was bitter. Christendom's salvation lay in unity, but its greatest weakness was division. Still, over time, endurance worked its slow magic. As decades passed, Europe's fractured kingdoms absorbed the lessons of defeat, invested in fortifications, and reformed their armies. Even when divided, they could resist just enough to buy time.
I trust this arrangement
And that
meets
time
with your
mattered.
approval.
Indeed.
It
I
allowed
believe it does.
firearms to mature, fortresses to spread, and new doctrines to take hold. The contest was no longer simply about who held the field after battle. It was about who could outlast whom, an empire of vast reach but fragile cohesion, or a continent fractured but learning, piece by painful piece, how to survive. From the first alarm bells after Nicopolis to the thunder of cannon at Vienna and Lepanto, Europe's struggle against the Ottoman Empire was more than a clash of armies, it was a contest of adaptation. The Ottomans had risen seemingly out of nowhere, turning a small frontier Beylik into a force that humbled kingdoms, shattered cities, and terrified a continent. For decades, they appeared unstoppable, their janissaries entrenched like walls of iron, their cavalry swift as storm winds, their sultan's purse deep enough to buy loyalty and defeat alike. To Christendom, it was a shattering revelation. The knightly code that had defined its wars for centuries proved powerless against trenches, bows, and gunpowder. At Nicopolis, at Varna, at Kosovo, valor was ground into the mud by discipline and patience. Pride had become a trap, honor a death sentence. And yet, in those defeats, the seeds of survival were sown. Captives like Constantine Mihailovic peeled back the curtain of the Ottoman war machine, showing its strengths but also its
What
cracks.
does this alliance demand of me?
Spies like Bertrand de la Brocquier returned with sober counsel, discipline, cohesion, respect for allies. Clerics like George of Hungary reminded Europe that the struggle was not only military but spiritual, that to lose faith was to lose everything. These voices, born from captivity, espionage, and endurance, became unexpected guides for a continent forced to rethink itself. The lessons were hard. They demanded humility, a word seldom spoken in knightly halls. They demanded patience, a virtue alien to the thunder of hooves. They demanded a transformation of war itself, from individual glory to collective survival. Slowly, painfully, Europe changed. By the 16th century, the change was visible everywhere. Pike-and-shot formations stood where once knights had charged. Fortresses of the Trace Italienne bristled against cannon fire. Armies no longer dissolved with the season but drilled year-round, financed by treasuries reformed under the pressure of survival. At Lepanto, Europe's ships fought with coordinated firepower rather than reckless boarding. At Vienna, defenders withstood the Sultan's siege not with bravado but with planning. The Ottomans remained formidable, but their aura of invincibility faded. Victories were still costly, defeats no longer unthinkable. And as the centuries wore on, it was Europe, not the empire, that increasingly held the initiative. The very force that had seemed poised to conquer Christendom had, paradoxically, compelled it to modernize. The storm from the east had not broken Europe, it had forged it. Yet the story was not one of triumph alone. The wars left scars that endured, ruined lands in the Balkans, villages emptied by the Divsurm, generations who lived in the shadow of raids and sieges. For those on the frontier, adaptation was not a matter of military theory but of survival, ambushes in forests, crops hidden from tax collectors, prayers whispered as armies marched past. Their suffering was the crucible in which Europe's transformation was tested. In the end, the Ottoman threat forced Christendom to answer a question that reached beyond war: could a civilization learn from its defeats, or would it cling to its illusions until destroyed? The answer, though uneven, was yes. Europe learned, slowly, reluctantly, but decisively. And in doing so, it ensured that the Sultan's dream of conquering the continent would remain just that, a dream. Thus the tale of Ottomans and Europe is not merely about battles but about survival, humility, and change. It is a reminder that enemies can be teachers, that arrogance is often more dangerous than swords, and that history punishes those who refuse to learn. Evolve, or die. For Christendom, that was the choice, and by learning from its defeats, it endured.